My mother's voice cracked before she finished the sentence, the sound sharp enough to cut through the noise of five kids yelling over each other, toys slamming into furniture, and a television blaring some cartoon no one was actually watching. She kept saying it under her breath like repeating it might undo the moment. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. I could see her through the shaky video call standing in the middle of her living room, one hand gripping her phone, the other pressed flat against her chest, like she was trying to slow her heart. Wrapping paper littered the floor. One child was crying on the couch, another was tugging at her sleeve, and somewhere off-screen someone knocked over a cup and burst into tears. All of it had been built on one assumption: that I would be there. That I would walk through the door, take over, fix it, absorb the chaos so everyone else could relax and enjoy Christmas. But I wasn't there. And for the first time in my life, no one had a backup plan. I watched the screen for a second longer, then let my phone drop face down on the table. My hands were steady, which surprised me. I had imagined this moment so many times over the years, always followed by guilt, panic, and me rushing in to make things right. Instead, there was just a strange, quiet stillness, the kind that settles in after something breaks, and you realize it can't be put back together the same way. That moment wasn't the beginning of this story. It was the result. The collision point everyone else pretended came out of nowhere. But I knew better. This story started weeks earlier, long before the screaming and the gasping and my mother's perfect holiday collapsing in real time. It started with something much smaller and much more familiar, an assumption that had followed me my entire life, so constant I barely noticed it anymore. I had always been the flexible one, the reliable one, the daughter who could rearrange her schedule because she didn't have anyone else depending on her. At least, that was how my family framed it. I was 30 years old, single, working full-time, paying my own bills, living in my own apartment. I had built a life that looked quiet from the outside, and in my family, quiet meant available. It meant optional. It meant my time belonged to whoever needed it most at the moment. No one ever said it outright, not at first. It was implied in the way plans were discussed around me instead of with me, in the way my name was dropped into conversations as a solution, not a person. Well, Claire has to work late. Mark already booked his flight. The kids need someone. You're good with them. You don't mind. You always help. It was never framed as a question, just a gentle nudge toward the role I had been playing for years without realizing I had auditioned for it. I told myself it was just how families worked, that everyone pitched in, that someday when my life looked more like theirs, things would even out. But they never did. Every holiday, every long weekend, every family gathering came with an unspoken expectation attached to my name. I was the one who arrived early and left late, the one who missed dinners to put kids to bed, the one who smiled through exhaustion because it felt easier than explaining why I was tired in the first place. This Christmas was supposed to be different. I didn't say that out loud to anyone, but I felt it deep in my bones. I was worn thin in a way sleep didn't fix. My job had been relentless that year, deadlines stacking on top of each other until every day felt like I was holding my breath. I had been counting down to the holidays not for the noise and the gatherings, but for the idea of quiet, of choosing how I spent my own time for once. I had plans, real ones, the kind you don't make casually. I had been saving for months, turning down little comforts, saying no to things I wanted, so I could say yes to this. It wasn't extravagant, but it mattered to me. It felt like a promise I had made to myself, one I was determined not to break. My mother didn't know that yet. Or maybe she did, and she just didn't think it would matter. The call came on a Tuesday evening while I was finishing up work at my kitchen table, my laptop still open, a mug of cold coffee forgotten beside me. I saw her name on my phone and felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not dread exactly, more like muscle memory. I answered anyway. She didn't waste time on small talk. She sounded cheerful, energized, the way she always did when she had already decided something and needed me to fall in line with it. She talked about Christmas like it was a production she was directing, listing who was coming, when, who was bringing what, how excited the kids were. I listened, nodding, even though she couldn't see me, waiting for the part where my role would appear. It always did. She mentioned the kids almost casually. 5 of them this year. Different ages, different needs, all loud, all high energy. She talked about how overwhelmed everyone was, how much work it would be to host, how nice it would be if the adults could have some time to themselves. Then she said, my name slid it into the conversation like it had always been there. You can take the kids for a couple of days, right? Just while we get everything set up. You're so good with them. I remember staring at the wall across from me, the faint mark where I had bumped a chair months earlier still visible. I remember how quiet my apartment felt in that moment, how far away her house suddenly seemed. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I said I had plans. I said I needed to think about it. My voice sounded calm, reasonable, the way it always did when I was trying not to rock the boat. She laughed it off. Of course you do, she said. But this is family. We all have to make sacrifices sometimes. She talked about how much everyone was counting on me, how stressed she was, how I was the only one who could really handle all 5 kids at once. It wasn't a request. It was a reminder of the role I had already been assigned. After we hung up, I sat there longer than I meant to, my phone still in my hand. I told myself I would call her back once I figured out how to explain myself better. Once I found the right words that wouldn't sound selfish or dramatic. But something felt different this time. Not louder, quieter. Like a realization settling in instead of an argument building up. I thought about how easily she had spoken for me, how natural it sounded to her. Like the decision had already been made somewhere without my involvement. And I wondered how many times that had happened before, how often I had stepped into situations already arranged around my compliance. The next few days were a blur of normal life. Work meetings, errands, answering emails. And threaded through all of it were little reminders of what was coming. A text from my sister about travel times. A message in the family group chat about meal planning. Comments that assumed my presence, my availability, my willingness. No one asked me directly. No one checked in. They just kept building. By the end of the week, it was clear that Christmas wasn't just planned. It was locked in. Reservations made, schedules set, expectations cemented. And somewhere in the middle of all that, my mother had told everyone I would be there to take care of the kids. She said it with confidence, with certainty, as if I had already agreed. I found out by accident, scrolling through the group chat late one night, watching the messages pile up. Relief, gratitude, little jokes about how lucky they were to have me. I felt something shift in my chest, not sharp, not explosive, just heavy and undeniable. I hadn't promised anything. I hadn't even been asked. And yet my name had become the foundation of everyone else's plans. I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, I didn't rush to fix it. I didn't type a clarification or call to smooth things over. I just sat with the truth of it, letting it settle in my body. They had already decided who I would be this Christmas. The question was whether I was finally ready to decide for myself. I stayed at the table long after the apartment went quiet again, the ceiling light humming faintly above me, my phone still where I had set it down. The realization from the night before had not faded with sleep. If anything, it felt heavier now, settled into my chest like something permanent. They had already moved forward without me, and what hurt was not the Christmas plan itself, but how ordinary it felt to them to do it that way. As the morning light crept through the blinds, I understood something I had never fully named before. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a pattern. One so familiar that none of them questioned it anymore, including me, until now. Growing up, I had been labeled responsible early. Not in the proud, celebratory way people like to imagine, but in the practical sense. I was the kid who remembered birthdays, who fed the dog without being asked, who stayed calm when something went wrong. When my siblings were loud or distracted or overwhelmed, I was the one who noticed what still needed to be done. Adults praised me for it. "You are such a help. You are so mature for your age." I absorbed those words like a blueprint, learning quickly that being needed was how I earned approval. As we got older, the labels shifted, but the expectations stayed the same. My siblings were busy. They had demanding jobs, marriages, children, schedules that could not bend. I had worked too long hours and deadlines that followed me home, but because I did not have a spouse or kids, my time was treated as flexible by default. Flexible was the polite word. Replaceable was the truth. No one ever sat me down and said, "This is your role." It was woven into conversations so gently it felt natural. Family dinners where plans were discussed as if I were already accounted for. Phone calls where my name appeared as a solution, not a question. It happened slowly enough that I told myself I was choosing it. That I was helping because I wanted to, not because it was expected. But when I looked back honestly, the choice had been an illusion for a long time. There were holidays I barely remembered enjoying because I spent them moving between rooms, cleaning spills, soothing tantrums, keeping the peace so others could relax. I watched plates get passed to me when kids needed food cut or someone had to step away. I heard laughter from the next room while I rocked a crying child, telling myself I would join them in a minute. That minute rarely came. If I ever hesitated, the response was always the same. A gentle reminder of how much everyone else had on their plate. A comment about how good I was with the kids. A sigh that carried just enough disappointment to make me feel small for even thinking about saying no. I learned to swallow that feeling quickly, to smile and step in before anyone had to ask twice. Over time, praise became a kind of currency. They thanked me, but the thanks always came with the expectation that I would do it again next time. Being dependable slowly erased my right to opt out. The more I showed up, the less my presence felt like a gift, and the more it felt like a guarantee. I had told myself this was what being part of a family meant. That sacrifice was normal. That someday when my life looked different, things would shift. But the truth was, my life had changed plenty over the years. The only thing that had not changed was how easily they assumed I would keep giving. The cost of that assumption was not something I could point to in one dramatic moment. It showed up quietly. In the exhaustion I carried into work on Mondays. In the invitations I declined because I was already committed to something I had not volunteered for. In the way I felt a little resentful, and then immediately ashamed of that resentment because good daughters were not supposed to feel that way. I minimized it even to myself. Everyone is tired, I told myself. Everyone makes compromises. But there was a difference between choosing to compromise and being volunteered without consent. I just had not let myself sit with that difference until now. This year, the weight of it all pressed down harder than usual. I felt it in my body before I could explain it with words. I was running on empty in a way I had never admitted out loud. The thought of giving up the quiet I had planned for myself felt less like generosity and more like erasing the last piece of myself I had been holding on to. And still, even knowing that, I felt the familiar pull of guilt. The voice in my head that said maybe I was overreacting. Maybe this was just how things were. Maybe wanting something different made me selfish. That was the power of the pattern. It trained me to doubt my own instincts before anyone else had to. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed again. A message in the family group chat. Someone asking about arrival times. Another person chiming in about grocery lists. My name appeared in the middle of it, attached to plans I had not confirmed. Reading it felt like watching myself disappear from the conversation, reduced to a role that everyone else understood without needing my input. I did not reply. Not because I was trying to make a statement, but because I did not know what to say that would not immediately pull me back into the familiar dance. I told myself I would answer later after I figured out how to explain myself clearly. But as the hours passed, the messages kept coming and no one noticed my silence. That was when it hit me. They did not need my confirmation to move forward. They were comfortable assuming they had it. The next day, I overheard my mother on the phone while I was visiting briefly to drop something off. I stood in the hallway, half out the door, keys already in my hand, when I heard her voice float in from the kitchen. She sounded confident, relaxed, reassuring someone on the other end that everything was handled, that I would take care of the kids, that it was all set. She did not lower her voice. She did not hesitate. She spoke as if she were stating a fact, not making a promise on someone else's behalf. I froze for a moment, listening, feeling that same heavy sensation settle in my chest again. She had already decided how this would go. I left without interrupting her. My steps quiet. My head buzzing. Sitting in my car afterward, I gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead, trying to calm my breathing. I told myself I should go back inside, that I should correct her, clear it up before it went any further. That was what I always did. I fixed things before they became problems, even when I was not the one who caused them. But something held me back. Not anger, not spite. Just a tired clarity. If I went back in there and said something now, I would be rescuing her from the consequences of a decision she had made without me. I would be teaching her again that it was safe to assume, because I would always step in before things fell apart. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I did not. The idea made my stomach twist. I thought about the kids, about how loud and chaotic things would get, about the disappointment that would ripple through the family if I was not there to smooth it all over. I imagined the looks, the phone calls, the accusations, the guilt pressed in familiar and sharp. But underneath it was something else, a small, steady thought that refused to go away. I did not create this situation. I was not the one who promised my time. I was not the one who built plans on an assumption instead of a conversation. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone face down on the nightstand, I realized how deeply I had been conditioned to step in before anyone else felt uncomfortable. How quickly I had learned to absorb inconvenience so others did not have to. And how little room that left for me to exist as anything other than the solution. Silence had always scared me. Silence meant conflict might surface. Silence meant someone might be disappointed. But silence also meant something else now. It meant I was no longer automatically agreeing to a story that had been written without me. I did not know yet what I was going to do. I only knew that staying quiet felt different this time. Intentional. Like standing still instead of being swept along. And as the days moved closer to Christmas, I could feel the space for choice narrowing, the weight of expectation pressing harder. Soon, I would have to decide whether to break the pattern or let it tighten around me again. The next morning, the pressure didn't come in a dramatic wave. It came in little taps that never stopped. A notification while I brushed my teeth. A buzz while I tried to focus at work. Another message while I stood in the grocery store staring at a shelf of cereal I didn't even want. Everyone else seemed to be moving through December like it was a train they had already boarded, and my name was printed on the ticket, whether I showed up or not. By midweek, it became impossible to pretend I could stay quiet until I found the perfect words. I was sitting at my desk on my lunch break, eating a limp salad and scrolling through the family group chat with one eye half closed. The way you look at something you already know will annoy you. My sister Brooke had posted a list of what she was bringing. My brother Ethan chimed in about a cooler and extra folding chairs. Someone asked if we needed more paper plates. Then my mother jumped in with her usual confident tone, bright and breezy like she was hosting a TV segment. "Don't worry about the kids," she wrote. "Lauren will have them. I already talked to her." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. I hadn't agreed. I hadn't even had a real conversation about it since that first call. But there it was, written out like a settled contract, like she was doing me a favor by smoothing it over for everyone. My hands went cold. It wasn't just the assumption anymore. It was documentation. It was my mother making me the guarantee again, only this time she wasn't even pretending it was a request. I could have replied in the chat right then. I could have typed something simple. I never said yes. Please stop volunteering me. But I knew what would happen if I did it in front of everyone. Brooke would send a bunch of messages about how stressed she was. Ethan would play confused, then irritated. My mother would act wounded and embarrassed and paint me as dramatic for pushing back in a group thread. And I was tired of being cast as the difficult one just because I wanted to be asked. So instead, I stepped away from my desk, walked outside the building into the chilly air, and called my mother directly. She answered on the second ring like she'd been holding the phone in her hand waiting. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, overly warm already in performance mode. "I was just about to call you." My jaw tightened. I doubt that I thought, but I didn't say it. I kept my voice even. "I saw the message you sent in the group chat." "Oh, good," she said quickly. "I'm glad you saw it. I just wanted everyone to feel settled, you know. It's a lot of moving parts, and I'm trying to keep Christmas from turning into chaos." I stood in the cold with my coat open, the wind cutting through my sweater. "Mom," I said, "you told them I will have the kids. You made it sound like I agreed." There was a pause that lasted half a beat, just long enough for her to adjust her story. Then she laughed softly like I'd said something cute. "Lauren, you and I talked about it. You know what we need. I was just confirming it so your sister and brother can plan." I swallowed, forcing my shoulders to relax. "I never confirmed it," I said. "I told you I had plans. I told you I needed to think." "You always say that?" She replied, her tone still sweet, but firmer now. "You need to think. You need a minute. You need to check your schedule. And then you do the right thing. That's who you are. The right thing." The phrase landed like a weight. It wasn't a compliment. It was a leash. "Mom," I said, "I'm not trying to be difficult. But you cannot tell people I agreed to something I didn't agree to." Her sigh was loud and theatrical, the kind that carried its own accusation. "I'm not telling them anything that isn't true. You know we need help. Brooke is bringing 3 kids. Ethan is bringing 2, and I'm hosting. I can't be everywhere at once." I took a breath and watched it fog in front of my mouth. "I understand that," I said. "But you're talking about me watching 5 kids for days, not just helping out for an hour while you pull something out of the oven." "It's not days," she snapped, the sweetness dropping away like a mask slipping. "It's just over the holiday stretch. Everyone is coming in early. People need time to settle, and the adults deserve a little break. That's normal. Normal for who I almost said. For the people who get the break." I tried again carefully. "You should have asked me before you told them." Her voice sharpened. "Lauren, I did ask. I called you. You didn't say no." The way she said it made my stomach turn, like the absence of no automatically meant yes, like silence was consent. I could hear the old logic in it, the same logic that had kept me trapped for years. I didn't answer immediately, and she barreled forward. "Besides," she said, "you know your sister's been having a hard time lately. She's stretched thin. And Ethan, well, Ethan and his wife barely get a minute to themselves. They're exhausted. I'm exhausted. Everyone has real responsibilities." There it was. The line I had been waiting for without wanting it. Real responsibilities. I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but it wasn't tears. It was anger. Quiet, controlled anger that made everything in me go still. "Mom," I said, my voice lower now, "I work full-time. I pay my rent. I have responsibilities." She made a dismissive sound. "I'm not saying you don't work. But you don't have a family of your own to juggle. You don't have little ones relying on you. You can be flexible. That's the benefit of your situation." Benefit. Like my life was a bargain bin version of adulthood. Like my time was cheaper, because I didn't have children. I pressed my fingers to my forehead and looked up at the gray sky. I could feel the old instinct rising in me, the urge to soothe her, to explain better, to promise something small so she would calm down. But I was done feeding that instinct. "You're talking about me like I'm not a person?" I said quietly. "Like I'm an extra set of hands you can schedule." She huffed. "Don't be dramatic. You love those kids." "I do love them," I said. "That's not the point. The point is, you don't have anyone else," she said, and the words came out sharper than she probably intended. "You're the only one who can do this without it throwing your whole life off." I actually laughed, one short sound that surprised me. "Without it throwing my whole life off." "Mom, you don't even know what my life is right now. You don't ask." She didn't respond to that. She didn't have to. The silence between us was proof. Then she shifted tactics like she always did when she sensed me pulling away. Her voice softened again, almost pleading. "Honey," she said, "I'm not trying to use you. I'm trying to keep this family together. Christmas is important. Your grandmother is coming. The neighbors are stopping by. Everyone looks forward to it. I need it to go well." The mention of my grandmother tightened something in my chest. My grandmother had always been the quiet one in the corner, smiling politely, noticing everything. She was the kind of woman who could make you feel seen with a single look, and I had a sudden uncomfortable feeling that she had been watching this dynamic for years without saying a word. I held on to that thought because it kept me grounded. "Mom," I said, "if Christmas is important, then you should treat the people involved like they matter, including me." Her patience snapped again. "I do treat you like you matter. I told everyone you were helping because I trust you. Because you're reliable. You should be proud of that." Reliable. The word that had become a trap. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. I wanted to yell. I wanted to list every time I had rearranged my life to make hers easier. Every time I had swallowed disappointment so my siblings could have fun. Every time I had sat alone after a family gathering, exhausted, wondering why I felt empty instead of loved. But I didn't. I knew where yelling would lead. It would become evidence that I was emotional, unreasonable, selfish. It would give her a story to tell that made her the victim. So I did something else. I slowed my voice down. "Mom," I said, "I'm telling you clearly. I did not agree to watch the kids. Please stop telling people I did." There was a short silence, then a brittle little laugh. "You're acting like I'm some villain. I'm your mother. This is family. We help each other." "Families ask," I said. "Families don't volunteer someone and then get mad when she objects." Her voice turned cold. "I don't have time for this. Do you know how much I have on my plate right now? The tree isn't even up yet. Your father is useless unless I give him a list. Brooke is already asking where she should put the kids' sleeping bags. Ethan is stressing about whether his toddler will nap. Everyone is counting on me to coordinate, and I am counting on you." There it was again, the center of it. Not that she needed help, that she needed control, that her image of Christmas required my compliance. I let her finish. I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to notice she was the only one talking. Then I said, "I'm not going to argue with you, but I need you to hear me. You cannot keep doing this. You cannot keep treating my time like it's free." Her tone sharpened into something I recognized from childhood, the voice that meant I was about to be punished emotionally. "You are being selfish." The word hit hard because it was the word I feared most. It was always the weapon, the label they used to herd me back into place. I swallowed and made myself stay steady. "I'm being honest," I said. "There's a difference." She scoffed. "Honesty? You know what's honest. You don't want to do it. You want to run off and play like you're still a teenager while the rest of us do the real work of adulthood." My hands curled into fists inside my coat pockets. I could feel the sting of it, the way she made independence sound like immaturity, the way she turned my life into a joke, because it didn't match hers. I wanted to tell her about my plans, about how hard I had worked this year, how close I was to burning out completely, about the thing I had been holding on to quietly as my own lifeline, but something in me warned against it. If I told her now, she would try to take it. She would either guilt me into giving it up, or she would sabotage it, and I knew that wasn't paranoia. It was experience. So I didn't reveal anything. Instead, I said, I need time to think about what I'm willing to do. And I need you to stop speaking for me in the meantime. She inhaled sharply. Lauren, Christmas is not something you think about. It's next week. People are booking things. Plans are set. Plans were set because she had set them. Without me. I forced myself to stay calm. I understand the timeline, I said. That's why you should have asked earlier instead of assuming. Her voice lifted indignant. I assumed because you always come through. Because you always do. And frankly, if you don't, I don't know what we're going to do. The honesty in that sentence was like a crack in the wall. Not because she admitted she needed me, but because she admitted there was no backup plan. There never was. They had built the entire holiday on me being the soft place they could fall without getting hurt. I let that sink in. It made my next words easier. I'm not saying no, I said carefully. I'm saying you need to stop telling people I said yes. I'm going to look at my schedule and I'll let you know what I can do. Her exhale was sharp, but I could hear relief under it. She took my careful language and twisted it into compliance just like she always did. Good, she said brisk again. That's all I needed. I knew you'd come around. I'll tell them you're figuring out details, but it's handled. I felt my stomach drop. Mom, I started. But she cut me off. I don't have time to go in circles. I have things to do. We're all counting on you, Lauren. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. And then she hung up. I stood there outside my office building staring at my phone like it had betrayed me. The wind slapped my cheeks, and for a second I couldn't breathe. Not because I was shocked, but because the pattern had just played out in real time. I had asked her to stop. She had heard me. And she had decided it didn't matter. When I walked back inside, the fluorescent lights felt too bright. I sat at my desk and tried to focus on my work, but the words on the screen wouldn't settle. My mind kept replaying the conversation, not the harsh parts, but the casual certainty. The way she had ended the call as if the decision had been made, as if I belonged to the plan. My phone buzzed again a few minutes later. A new message in the family group chat. Mom wrote, Lauren and I just talked. She's going to handle the kids, we're just working out timing. Thank goodness, I knew I could count on her. My chest tightened so hard it almost hurt. I stared at the message, then at the little flurry of reactions beneath it. Brooke sending a heart. Ethan replying with relief. Someone else saying you're a lifesaver. No one asked me if it was true. No one questioned how she could speak for me so confidently. They just accepted it because acceptance was easier than looking at how they had been treating me. I set my phone down and looked around my quiet office. The hum of the air vent, the tapping of someone's keyboard down the hall. Ordinary sounds in an ordinary day, and yet I felt like I had stepped onto a line I couldn't unsee now. I could feel it in my bones. If I corrected them, I would be the problem. If I stayed silent, they would keep building. Either way, the holiday was moving toward me like a train, and I was running out of time to decide whether I was going to step onto the tracks again or finally move out of the way. The days after that message felt unreal, like I was watching my own life through thick glass. Everything moved forward without me touching it. Plans stacked on top of plans, decisions layered so neatly it was almost impressive. If I had not been the one erased from the process, I might have admired the efficiency. I did not respond in the group chat. Not right away. I told myself I was buying time, that I needed space to think clearly. But the truth was simpler and harder. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped interrupting the story they were telling about me. By the next morning, the family machine was fully in motion. Brooke posted screenshots of hotel confirmations for a night away she and her husband had booked, thanking Mom again for handling childcare. Ethan chimed in about arriving early so the kids could get settled, adding that it was such a relief knowing I had everything under control. My mother replied to each message with the same calm confidence, reinforcing the picture she had already painted. "Everything's covered. Lauren's got it. Don't worry." Reading it made my stomach churn, not because I felt guilty but because I felt invisible. I scrolled through the thread, slowly noticing details I had always missed before. The way my name appeared without anyone addressing me directly. The way decisions were phrased as statements, not questions. The way relief rippled through the group as soon as my assumed role was confirmed. It was like watching a structure lock into place brick by brick, built on something that had never been agreed to. I thought about typing a correction more times than I could count. Just one sentence. "I haven't agreed to this. Please stop saying I have." It would have taken seconds. But I knew exactly what that would trigger. A flood of messages, explanations, defensiveness, my mother's wounded tone. The familiar spiral where I ended up reassuring everyone that I loved them, that I wasn't trying to ruin anything, that I would figure it out. And then somehow I would be back where I started. So I stayed quiet. Silence was not comfortable. It pressed on me constantly, especially at night. I would lie in bed staring at the ceiling, my phone face down on the nightstand, my mind replaying every scenario where this could blow up in my face. I imagined the kids' disappointed expressions. I imagined my siblings' anger. I imagined my mother telling anyone who would listen that she didn't know what had gotten into me. The guilt crept in like it always did, whispering that I was being cruel by not stepping in early. That I was letting things get worse on purpose, that a good daughter would never allow this much uncertainty to hang in the air. But there was another voice, now quieter but steadier. It reminded me that none of this uncertainty belonged to me. I had not created it. I had not promised anything. I was just refusing to absorb the consequences of someone else's certainty. Midweek, the subplot I had been trying not to think about finally demanded my attention. An email popped up from work while I was in a meeting, the subject line enough to make my heart jump. It was the confirmation I had been waiting for, the thing I had worked toward all year. The opportunity was real and the timing was fixed. It overlapped exactly with the days my mother expected me to be glued to her couch, managing 5 children while everyone else enjoyed themselves. I read the email twice, then a third time, my pulse quickening. This wasn't something I could postpone. It wasn't a casual plan I could slide around. It was a line in the sand for my own life, a moment where choosing my family would mean walking away from something that mattered deeply to me. I closed my laptop slowly and leaned back in my chair, the weight of it settling in. This was the cost they never saw. The things I quietly gave up without announcing them. The way my life shrank a little every time I said yes out of habit instead of choice. That afternoon, my mother called again. I let it ring until voicemail, my hands shaking just enough to notice. A minute later, a text followed. "Just checking in. Wanted to make sure you're all set for next week. Let me know if you need anything." The irony almost made me laugh. If I needed anything. As if the entire structure wasn't already leaning on me. I didn't reply. The next day, I met a coworker for lunch, someone who had no stake in my family dynamics, and no reason to soften the truth. She asked casually what I was doing for Christmas, and for once I didn't default to the usual vague answer. I told her I wasn't sure yet, that things were complicated. She nodded, sympathetic but detached, then moved on to talking about her own plans. The ease of it struck me. No guilt, no expectations, no assumption that my time belonged to anyone else. That contrast stayed with me. By Thursday, the group chat had shifted into high gear. Packing lists, questions about bedding, a reminder from Mom about snack preferences and nap schedules, instructions directed at me, thinly veiled as helpful tips. I read them all, my jaw tight, my chest aching with a mix of anger and something like grief. I was watching myself disappear from the conversation in real time. Not erased completely, just reduced to a function. The babysitter. The buffer. The solution. What hurt most was not that they needed help. It was that they did not see the difference between needing help and owning someone. That evening, I stopped by my parents' house to drop off a borrowed book, telling myself it would be quick. The house was already buzzing with pre-holiday energy, boxes stacked by the wall, decorations half unpacked. My mother moved through the space with practiced authority, directing my father, answering calls, checking lists. She barely looked up when I came in. "Perfect timing," she said. "I was just telling Brooke where you'll set up the kids' sleeping area." I froze in the doorway, the book still in my hand. "Where I'll set it up." "Mom," I said carefully, "we need to talk." She waved a hand without turning around. "Not now. I'm in the middle of something." I stood there for a moment, watching her coordinate, watching the assumption play out in physical space now, not just on a screen. My father passed by with a box of lights, giving me a quick smile, already operating under the same story. Later, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. She finally turned, irritation flashing across her face. "What is it?" "You're telling people things that aren't settled," I said. "You're planning around me like I've already agreed." Her expression hardened. "We already talked about this." "No," I said. "You talked at me. You didn't listen." She glanced toward the kitchen where my father was now fumbling with a drawer, clearly trying not to eavesdrop. Her voice dropped sharp and controlled. "I do not have time for this right now. Everything is already in motion." That sentence landed like a verdict. Already in motion. As if momentum itself excused consent. I felt something shift in me, then a subtle but decisive click. She wasn't confused. She wasn't misunderstanding me. She was choosing to move forward because she believed I would cave like I always had. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply said, "You should stop making plans that depend on me until we've actually agreed on something." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening to back out?" I shook my head slowly. "I'm asking you to stop assuming." She scoffed. "You're overthinking this. You always get anxious right before things like this, and then once it starts, you're fine. You'll see." There it was again. The certainty. The dismissal. The confidence that my discomfort was temporary and irrelevant. I realized then that nothing I said in that moment would change her behavior. The only thing that ever had was action. I left shortly after, my heart pounding, my hands cold on the steering wheel as I drove home. The house felt too quiet when I walked in, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. I set the book down on the counter and leaned against it, closing my eyes. For the first time, I didn't feel confused about what was happening. I felt clear. She was gambling. Not consciously, maybe not maliciously, but she was betting her perfect Christmas on my inability to disappoint her. She had built everything on that assumption because it had always paid off before. And suddenly, I understood something else just as clearly. If I corrected her now, if I rushed in to save the plan, I would be confirming that the gamble was sound. That it was safe to keep doing this. That my boundaries were negotiable under pressure. Silence stopped being passive in that moment. It became a line I was choosing not to cross. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my calendar open, the dates glaring back at me. The days she expected me. The days that mattered to me. The overlap was undeniable. I rested my hands on the table and took a slow breath. I could feel the familiar fear rising, the old instinct to fix, to smooth, to sacrifice. But beneath it was something new, something steadier. They had no backup plan. Not because one was impossible, but because they had never needed one. I had always been it. And for the first time, I let myself imagine what would happen if that safety net simply wasn't there. I didn't talk to my family that night. I didn't open the group chat again. I made myself dinner, something simple, and ate it standing at the counter because sitting down felt like too much commitment. My mind kept circling the same thought, not dramatic, not angry, just steady and unsettling. They had built everything on me without asking, and they felt safe doing it. That realization stayed with me into the next morning, clinging like fog. By the time I got to work, my shoulders were already tight. I answered emails, nodded through meetings, did everything I was supposed to do, but underneath it all was a pressure that needed somewhere to go. I knew if I kept it contained much longer, it would either explode in the wrong direction or collapse inward like it always had before. So instead of calling my mother back, I called someone else. Her name was Diane. She wasn't part of my family, which was the point. We had worked together for years, long enough to know each other's tells, long enough to have seen each other through bad bosses, worse deadlines, and a few personal disasters. She was in her early 60s, sharp as a tack, and she had a way of listening that made you feel like you were finally being heard instead of evaluated. She answered on the first ring. "You sound like you're about to either cry or do something irreversible," she said, skipping hello entirely. "Which one is it?" I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Maybe both," I said. "Do you have a minute?" "I have a lunch break and a strong suspicion this won't fit into a minute," she replied. "Talk." I told her everything. Not the polished version I usually offered when people asked how my family was doing, but the messy, unfiltered truth. The assumption. The group chat message. My mother speaking for me like I wasn't even in the room. The way everyone else seemed relieved the moment my name was attached to the problem. Diane didn't interrupt. She made small sounds now and then to let me know she was still there, but she didn't rush me or soften anything. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the line. Then she said very calmly, "They're not confused. They're comfortable." The words landed hard. "What do you mean?" I asked, even though something in me already knew. She didn't hesitate. "They're comfortable assuming you'll fix it because you always have. They don't see it as asking too much because in their minds you've already agreed by being who you are." I rubbed my forehead. I told her I didn't agree. Diane snorted softly. "Of course you did. And it didn't matter." Her bluntness made my chest tighten, but it also felt like relief. Like someone had finally named the thing I had been dancing around for years. "Lauren," she said, "you are not being asked to help. You are being assigned." That word again. Assigned. It made everything snap into focus. I tried to defend them out of habit. "They're just overwhelmed. My mom's hosting. The kids are a lot. They don't mean it badly." Diane cut in gently but firmly. "Intent doesn't change impact. And being overwhelmed doesn't give anyone the right to spend your time like it's theirs." I was quiet, staring at the parking lot outside my office window. Cars came and went. People walked by laughing, carrying coffee, living their lives without negotiating them with an entire extended family. She continued, "And before you say it, no, this isn't about the kids. This is about adults refusing to plan responsibly because they've always had you as a cushion." That stung because it was true. "I don't want to hurt anyone," I said. "Especially the kids." She sighed softer now. "Setting boundaries isn't hurting people. It just feels that way when the people benefiting from your lack of boundaries don't like the change." I swallowed. "It feels wrong to just let it blow up." Diane's voice sharpened slightly. "Wrong for who?" I didn't answer right away. "For them," I finally said. "For my mom. For my siblings." "And what about you?" she asked. The question hung there between us. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. The truth felt awkward and heavy. I had spent so long prioritizing everyone else's comfort that I wasn't used to weighing my own equally. "I matter too," I said quietly. "Yes, you do," Diane replied without hesitation. "And here's the part you're not going to like. If you keep trying to warn them, explain yourself, or negotiate, they will keep pushing until you cave, because that's what's always worked." I felt my pulse pick up. "So what am I supposed to do?" She paused, choosing her words carefully. You stop managing their feelings. You stop correcting their assumptions for them. And you let reality do what your words never have. The idea made my stomach flip. You're saying I should just let it happen. I'm saying you didn't create this mess, she said. You're just the one who's been cleaning it up for free. If you step back now, they'll finally have to see what they've been leaning on. That sounded dangerous. It sounded selfish. It sounded like everything I had been trained not to be. They'll say I blindsided them, I said. They already blindsided you, she replied. You're just refusing to play along. I thought about the group chat, about my mother's confident messages, about the way my siblings had relaxed the moment my name appeared. I thought about the email from work, the opportunity I would have to walk away from if I gave in again. Diane wasn't done. Let me ask you something, she said. If you disappeared tomorrow, truly unavailable, not negotiable, what would they do? I pictured it. The scrambling, the stress, the sudden realization that 5 kids were still 5 kids whether I was there or not. They'd figure it out, I said slowly. Exactly, she said. They'd figure it out. They just don't want to, as long as they don't have to. The conversation ended not with a grand plan, but with a quiet shift inside me. Diane didn't tell me what to do step by step. She didn't encourage me to be cruel or dramatic. She just named the truth and trusted me to sit with it. After we hung up, I stayed at my desk longer than necessary, my lunch untouched. I replayed her words in my head. Comfortable, assigned, cushion. When I finally drove home that evening, the sky was already dark, the streets lit with holiday decorations. Every house I passed seemed wrapped in lights and expectation. I pulled into my parking space and sat there with the engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. For years, I had mistaken my reliability for virtue. I had told myself that stepping in was love, that sacrifice was the price of belonging. But what if all it had really done was teach people they didn't have to consider me? Inside my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and dropped my bag by the door. The quiet wrapped around me like a blanket. No kids crying. No schedules to manage. No one needing anything from me in that moment. I opened my calendar again, the dates stark and unforgiving. The days my family expected me. The days that mattered to me. Seeing them side by side felt different now, not like a conflict, but like a choice. I didn't decide everything that night. I didn't make any announcements or send any messages. But something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer looking for a way to fit myself into their plan. I was starting to consider what it would look like to step out of it entirely. And once that thought took hold, it refused to let go. The next few days stretched out in a way that made time feel thick and slow. I moved through them carefully, like I was carrying something fragile inside me that might shatter if I wasn't deliberate enough. Diane's words stayed with me, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Stop managing their feelings. Let reality do what words never have. So I did something that went against every instinct I had been trained into. I stayed quiet on purpose. Messages kept coming. Not frantic, yet not suspicious. Just the usual steady stream of logistics and reassurance that had always filled the space before a family gathering. Brooke asking about snacks for the kids. Ethan checking in on arrival times. My mother chiming in with confident answers to questions no one had directed at me. I read everything. I absorbed every word, and I said nothing. At first, the silence felt like holding my breath underwater. My chest tightened every time my phone buzzed. My fingers twitched with the urge to respond, to clarify, to smooth things over before anyone got upset. That reflex was so ingrained it felt physical, like muscle memory. I had spent years being the one who fixed misunderstandings before they became conflicts, even when the misunderstanding wasn't mine. But each time I resisted, something else happened. The panic eased just a little. The family filled the silence quickly. Faster than I expected. Where there had once been vague plans, now there were specifics. Times, lists, commitments made with absolute confidence. It was like watching a story write itself around me with my role already cast and my lines assumed. "Thank you again for taking this on," Ethan wrote one afternoon. "We really needed this break." Brooke followed with a string of messages about how overwhelmed she'd been lately and how grateful she was that everything was handled. Handled. The word stuck with me. I hadn't handled anything. I hadn't agreed to anything. And yet my silence had been translated into consent with alarming ease. That realization made my stomach turn, but it also sharpened something in me. This wasn't about miscommunication. This was about convenience. The guilt came in waves. Sometimes it hit while I was driving, the radio playing softly as I stared at the road ahead. Sometimes it crept in at night when the apartment was too quiet and my thoughts had nowhere to go. I imagined the kids showing up, bags in hand, expecting me. I imagined my mother's stress mounting. I imagined the disappointment that would ripple outward if I didn't step in. And every time the old script tried to take over. "Just help this once. You can deal with the fallout later. Don't ruin Christmas." But there was another script now, one I was just beginning to read. "You didn't create this. You don't have to save them from it." I thought about all the times I had jumped in at the last minute, how often my willingness had been rewarded not with relief, but with higher expectations the next time. I saw the pattern clearly now. The earlier I intervened, the less responsibility anyone else felt to plan differently. Midweek, my mother sent a voice message. Her tone was light, almost cheerful, the way it always was when she believed everything was under control. "Just wanted to check in," she said. "We're finalizing sleeping arrangements. I told Brooke you'll take the guest room with the kids." "That works, right? Call me when you have a minute." I listened to it twice, my jaw clenched. She wasn't asking. She was informing me of decisions already made. Again. I didn't call back. Instead, I went for a walk, the cold air biting at my cheeks, my breath visible as I exhaled. I needed the movement to bleed off the nervous energy building in my body. With each step, I reminded myself why I was doing this. Not to punish, not to make a point, but to stop reinforcing a system that only worked because I kept sacrificing myself. By Thursday, the plans had taken on a weight of their own. Money had been spent, reservations confirmed, schedules locked. The family wasn't just assuming my presence now, they were depending on it financially and logistically. That should have scared me more than it did. Instead, it clarified things. I realized then that correcting them at this stage wouldn't just be clarification. It would be rescue. It would be me stepping in yet again to prevent discomfort that I hadn't caused. It would tell them loud and clear that they could keep doing this because I would always cave when the stakes were high enough. And I couldn't unsee that anymore. Still, the doubt gnawed at me. I wasn't immune to it. I wondered if Diane was wrong, if I was taking things too far. I replayed conversations in my head, imagining different outcomes if I just explained myself better. If I was clearer, kinder, firmer. But the truth was, I had been all of those things before, and none of it had changed the outcome. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the tension in my own face. My shoulders were tight. My jaw was set. I looked like someone bracing for impact. I pressed my palms against the counter and took a long breath. This wasn't easy. Choosing not to intervene didn't feel powerful in the way movies make rebellion feel. It felt lonely. It felt like standing in the middle of a room where everyone else was talking over you and deciding not to shout to be heard. The next morning, the point of no return crept closer. An email from my mother arrived with a subject line that made my heart drop. Final details. She had attached a full schedule, pickup times, drop-off times, who was sleeping where, what the kids would eat, when the adults were planning to go out together. And there it was, in black and white. My name assigned to every gap, every stretch of time that required patience and energy and presence. I sat at my desk staring at the screen, my hands trembling just enough to notice. This was the moment when the pressure peaked, when it would have been so easy to reply with a correction to stop the train before it fully derailed. I imagined typing a response. I imagined the relief on the other end. I imagined the praise. Thank goodness. We were worried. And I imagined how next year it would all happen again. I closed the email without responding. That was the moment I knew I was crossing into something new. Silence stopped being accidental. It became a choice I was making with my eyes open. The guilt didn't disappear. If anything, it got louder. But I started to recognize it for what it was. Not proof that I was doing something wrong, but evidence of how deeply I had been conditioned to put everyone else first. The children crossed my mind often. I worried about them, about how confusing this would be if things fell apart. I reminded myself over and over that they were not my responsibility alone, that adults far more capable than me existed in that family. That inconvenience was not harm. By Friday afternoon, the atmosphere in the group chat shifted subtly. Questions repeated themselves. Details were clarified again. There was an edge to the messages now, a faint note of urgency beneath the confidence. I could feel it. The family was approaching the edge of something they hadn't prepared for. That night, as I sat on my couch with a blanket pulled up around me, my phone in my hand, I watched the messages roll in without responding. Each one felt like another brick laid onto a structure that was growing more fragile by the hour. I thought about what Diane had asked me. If you disappeared tomorrow, what would they do? The answer was coming whether any of us were ready for it or not. And as uncomfortable as it was, I knew one thing for sure. If I stepped in now, I would be betraying myself all over again. I woke up before my alarm. The room still dark and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own breathing. For a few seconds I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember why my chest felt so tight. Then it all rushed back. The messages, the schedules, my name printed neatly into everyone else's plans, the silence I had been holding like a shield. This was the morning everything shifted. I swung my legs out of bed and padded into the kitchen, the cold floor biting at my feet. The coffee maker hummed as it warmed up, a familiar sound that usually grounded me. Today, it felt ceremonial, like the start of something I couldn't stop once it began. I sat at the table with my mug cupped in both hands and opened my calendar again. I had looked at it every day that week, but this time I wasn't searching for a loophole or a compromise. I was looking at it the way you look at a door you've already decided to walk through. The plan I had made for myself months earlier stared back at me from the screen. The dates, the confirmations, the thing I had quietly worked toward while everyone else assumed my time was theirs. It wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was just mine. And it mattered more than I had admitted even to myself. I thought about why I had planned it in the first place, not because I wanted to escape my family, but because I needed space to breathe, to hear my own thoughts without interruption, to feel like my life belonged to me for once, not as an afterthought. Every year, I told myself I would do something different next time. Every year, next time never came. Until now. My phone buzzed on the table, startling me. A message from the group chat. Mom reminding everyone about arrival times. Brooke thanking her again for coordinating everything. Ethan chiming in with a joke about finally getting a break. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold. The irony pressed down on me, sharp and almost absurd. They were celebrating a solution that didn't exist. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I could still stop this. I could type something vague, something non-committal that would buy them time. I could offer a partial solution, a few hours, one night, anything that would soften the blow and keep me in my familiar role. The thought made my stomach twist. I closed the chat without responding and opened the other tab on my laptop instead. The one I had been avoiding and staring at in equal measure all week. The final step. The one that turned a possibility into a fact. My heart thudded in my ears as I read through the details again, checking dates, times, confirmations. Everything lined up. Everything was ready. All it needed was my decision. I took a breath, then another. My hand trembled slightly as I moved the cursor. Not because I didn't know what I wanted, but because I did. Clicking that button felt like crossing a line I wouldn't be able to erase. I thought about my mother's voice, confident and dismissive. I thought about the kids, their noise and energy and innocence. I thought about Diane's calm certainty. You stop managing their feelings. Let reality do what your words never have. I clicked. The screen refreshed, and just like that, the plan became real. No more, maybe. No more room for negotiation. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing, a strange mix of fear and relief washing through me. I had done it. For a moment, I just sat there staring at the confirmation on the screen. My hands were shaking now openly, and I pressed them flat against the table to steady myself. This was the point of no return. Whatever happened next, I had chosen it. The fear came fast, crashing in right behind the relief. What have you done? How are you going to explain this? What if they never forgive you? I closed my eyes and let the questions pass without answering them. Fear didn't mean I was wrong. It meant I was doing something new. The rest of the day passed in a strange blur. I went to work. I answered emails. I smiled at coworkers. On the surface, everything was normal. Underneath, it felt like I was carrying a secret that buzzed just under my skin. Messages continued to roll in from my family, cheerful and confident. My mother sent another reminder about what time the kids would arrive. Brooke asked if I preferred almond milk or regular. Ethan joked about how he was already dreaming of sleeping in. I read every word with a detached clarity I hadn't felt before. They were so sure, so completely unaware. At one point, I opened a new message, my fingers moving on autopilot. I typed a few words, then deleted them. Typed again. Deleted again. Each version felt like a betrayal of the decision I had just made. If I told them now, I would be inviting the storm early. Tears, accusations, guilt trips, endless calls. They would have time to regroup, to pressure me to rearrange things just enough to make me feel obligated to step back in. No, I thought. Not this time. I shut my phone off completely for the rest of the afternoon. The silence felt heavy at first, then oddly freeing. Without the constant buzzing, my thoughts slowed. I could hear myself again. That evening, I took a walk through my neighborhood, the air sharp and cold, Christmas lights twinkling on houses as families bustled inside. I passed children laughing on the sidewalk, parents calling after them, the familiar soundtrack of the season. Instead of guilt, I felt a surprising sense of distance, like I was finally observing instead of absorbing. Back at my apartment, I packed a small bag, just enough to make the plan tangible. Folding clothes felt grounding, each item a quiet affirmation of my choice. I wasn't running away. I was stepping towards something. My phone stayed off until late that night, when I finally turned it back on and set it face down on the counter. Notifications flooded in immediately, lighting up the screen, but I didn't look. Not yet. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, staring out the window at the darkened street below. I tried to picture the next few days, the moment they would realize, the confusion, the anger, the scramble. A part of me wanted to fast forward through it all, to wake up on the other side of the fallout where everything was settled and calm. But another part understood that this discomfort was necessary, that if I skipped it, nothing would really change. Just before bed, I picked up my phone again and glanced at the latest message in the group chat. My mother once more reassuring everyone. Everything is under control. Lauren will be here tomorrow. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Tomorrow the truth would begin to surface. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to rush ahead of it to make it easier for everyone else. I turned off the light, crawled into bed, and let the darkness close in, knowing the countdown had truly begun. By morning, the air felt different, not because anything had happened yet, but because I knew something was coming that no one else could see. I moved through my routine with an odd, calm, showering, dressing, making coffee, packing my lunch, all while my phone kept lighting up on the counter like it was trying to drag me back into the same old loop. When I finally looked, the messages were the usual blend of holiday logistics and forced cheer. Brooke asked if I could pick up a specific brand of kid snacks on my way over, because apparently her twins would only eat one kind now. Ethan said they might arrive earlier than planned since the baby had been up all night, and they wanted to get settled. My mother replied to both of them with her steady confidence, telling everyone not to stress, everything was handled, Lauren would take care of it. I read that line and felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not guilt, not panic. Just clarity. It was like watching someone walk toward a cliff with their eyes closed, smiling because they trusted the ground would always be there. The first cracks showed up later that afternoon. Brooke sent a message asking what time I wanted the kids dropped off at my parents' house, and for the first time, it wasn't phrased like a casual assumption. There was a little edge to it, a subtle uncertainty. "You're still good with tomorrow morning, right?" she wrote. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering. I could have answered then. I could have told her everything, saved her from the shock that was coming. But the moment I stepped in to reassure her, the whole system would tighten around me again. They would treat my response like confirmation, like a contract signed in blood, and the pressure would only get worse. So I didn't reply. Within minutes, she sent another message, shorter. "Lauren." Then another, a little sharper. "Please respond." The urge to type back was immediate, like a reflex. My chest tightened. My hands started to shake. I hated being the cause of someone else's discomfort, even when that discomfort came from their own assumptions. I set the phone down on the table and walked into my bedroom instead, forcing myself to fold laundry. I didn't need to fold anything to keep my hands busy. I told myself I wasn't ignoring her out of cruelty. I was refusing to play my old role of calming everyone down before they had to face what they were doing. Still, it didn't feel noble. It felt sickening. The next crack came from Ethan, of all people. He called that evening while I was heating leftovers, his name flashing across my screen. I stared at it for a moment, then answered, not because I wanted to talk, but because I needed to know what version of reality they were living in. His voice was upbeat at first, the way it always was when he wanted something but didn't want to admit it. "Hey," he said. "Just checking in." I made my voice neutral. "Hey." So he said, "Mom told me you're taking the kids starting tomorrow. I just wanted to make sure you had everything you need, like the pack and play bottles, whatever. Everything I need. Like this was already happening, like the only question was whether I had enough supplies." I leaned against the counter and stared at the microwave clock. "Ethan," I said slowly, "why are you calling me about this now?" He laughed like I was overthinking. "Because it's tomorrow and the baby has been a handful, and I just want to make sure it goes smoothly." I could hear a child squealing in the background, then the muffled sound of his wife saying something I couldn't make out. I swallowed. "Did Mom tell you?" I agreed. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough to feel the weight of it. He cleared his throat. "She said, you two worked it out," he said. "That you were handling it." Handling it? That word again, like I was a hired service, not his sister. I could have corrected him right then. I could have dropped the truth like a bomb and listened to the explosion. But something held me back. Not fear. Not indecision. Something more strategic. I needed them to see who had created the problem. If I turned this into a back and forth with Ethan, he would focus on me, my tone, my timing, my supposed attitude, instead of the bigger truth. So I said, "I'm still working out my schedule." There was another pause, sharper this time. "What does that mean?" It means I haven't agreed to anything yet, I said. I told Mom weeks ago I had plans. Ethan exhaled hard. Come on, Lauren, you're really going to do this now. I felt heat rise in my face. Do what? Make it complicated, he snapped. We already booked everything based on what Mom said. Based on what Mom said. There it was, the hinge of everything. They had built their choices on my mother's certainty, not my consent. I kept my voice even. You booked things without checking with me. His tone turned defensive. Because Mom said you were good. She said you'd take the kids. That's what she said. I could have said more. I could have pointed out how often he let Mom speak for me because it was easier. I could have asked why he never thought to confirm with me before making plans that depended on my labor. Instead, I said, I'm not arguing with you. I'm telling you the truth. I did not agree. In the background, a child started crying. Ethan muttered something, then his wife's voice cut in, strained. Who are you talking to? She asked. My brother covered the phone slightly and hissed something back. Then he returned, his tone lower, more urgent. Lauren. He said this is going to be a disaster. The kids are already wired. We're exhausted. Mom can't handle all of them alone. The way he said it made my stomach clench, because I could hear the truth under his frustration. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about losing the safety net. I felt my voice soften just a fraction. Ethan, I said, why is it always my job to make sure this isn't a disaster? He didn't answer. Not really. He said something about family, about everyone pitching in, about how I was good at it, like being good at something meant you owed it forever. We ended the call with tension still hanging in the air, and when I set my phone down, my hands were trembling again. I leaned over the sink and took a slow breath, trying to steady myself. This was it. The shift. The point where small doubts were turning into real stress. Later that night, my mother called. I watched it ring, my pulse pounding, and I didn't answer. A minute later, she sent a text. Call me back. We need to finalize tomorrow. Finalize. As if there was still something to finalize beyond my compliance. I didn't respond. The next morning, the cracks widened. Brooke posted a message in the group chat directed at my mother, not me. Mom, did Lauren confirm the drop-off time? She asked. She's not answering me. My mother replied quickly. She's probably busy with work. Don't worry. She's coming. She always comes through. Reading that made something in me go still. She always comes through. That wasn't faith. That was entitlement dressed up like confidence. I tried to focus on my day, but the tension followed me everywhere. At work, I stared at spreadsheets and heard my mother's voice in my head. She always comes through. In the break room, someone asked if I was ready for the holidays, and I smiled like everything was normal while my stomach churned. By late afternoon, another message arrived, not from my mother, not from my siblings, but from my aunt. Aunt Denise was the one who always noticed things. She never said much in group chats, but when she did, it landed. She texted me directly. Honey, are you okay? Your mom says you're helping with the kids all week, but you haven't been yourself lately. I stared at her message, and for the first time I felt something shift into place that I hadn't fully understood before. It wasn't just that my mother wanted help. It was that she wanted the appearance of help. She wanted to be the perfect hostess, the perfect matriarch, the woman who pulled off a flawless Christmas. And she needed me as the invisible labor behind that illusion. It hit me like a quiet reveal, not shocking but undeniable. My mother wasn't just leaning on me, she was using me as her insurance policy. The guarantee that no matter how much she overpromised, she could still deliver because I would cover the gaps. That was why she panicked when I pushed back. Not because she would miss me, because her image would crack. I didn't respond to my aunt either, not yet. I couldn't. If I started explaining to one person, the story would spread, and my mother would tighten her grip harder. That evening, I packed a little more. Not everything, not the full suitcase, but enough to make it real in my hands. I folded clothes, carefully stacked them, zipped a small bag, then set it by the door where I could see it. My phone buzzed again. A group chat message from my mother, longer this time, more detailed, as if more detail could force reality into place. Tomorrow morning, kids drop off at 10. Lauren will be here. Brooke and Ethan, you two can go finish your errands and have some adult time. We all deserve a little peace before Christmas. We all deserve a little peace. I read it twice, my jaw tightening. Peace for them had always been purchased with my exhaustion. I could feel the air shifting the way it does before a storm. They were getting nervous. They were starting to notice the silence. They were asking questions not because they respected my choice, but because they needed to know whether their plan was safe. My mother's confidence began to fray at the edges. She called twice that night. I let both go to voicemail. The voicemails weren't angry yet, but they were tighter, the cheerful mask slipping. "Call me back," she said. "We need to talk. Don't do this. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Don't do this." Like refusing to be used was something I was doing to her, not something she had done to me for years. I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen until it dimmed. My heart was pounding, but my mind felt strangely clear. The truth was pressing against the surface now. It couldn't stay hidden much longer. Tomorrow would bring questions they couldn't dodge with cheerful reassurances. And I could feel it, the exact moment when my mother would realize her story was about to collapse, when she would scramble to control the narrative, when she would try to pull me back in with guilt and fear. I set my phone down and looked at the small bag by the door, the quiet proof of a choice I had already made. The countdown was nearly over, and the next interaction would expose everything. Morning arrived with a sharpness that made everything feel exposed. The light through the windows was too bright, the air too cold, like the world had decided there would be no soft edges left to hide behind. I stood in my kitchen with my coat already on, keys in my hand, listening to my phone vibrate against the counter again and again. I didn't look at it right away. I knew who it would be. I knew what they would say. Instead, I poured myself a glass of water and drank it slowly, grounding myself in the simple act. The bag by the door waited, zipped and ready. Not large, not dramatic. Just enough to carry what I needed. Just enough to prove to myself that this was real. When I finally picked up my phone, the screen was a wall of missed calls and messages. My mother, Brooke, Ethan, the group chat exploding with question marks and half sentences. Panic had replaced confidence overnight. "Mom, where is Lauren? She's not answering. Did something happen? She was supposed to be here by 10:10. That was the drop-off time my mother had announced with such certainty. 10 was the moment her entire plan hinged on my physical presence, and now it was nearly 10:15. I felt a strange calm wash over me as I read through the messages. This was the moment Diane had described. The moment reality began doing the work words never could. My mother called again, and this time I answered. Her voice hit me before I could say anything. "Where are you?" she demanded, skipping any greeting. The background noise was unmistakable. Kids yelling, something crashing, the television blaring at an unreasonable volume. I took a breath. "I'm not coming, Mom." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. "What do you mean you're not coming?" "I mean exactly that," I said. "I told you weeks ago I had other plans. I never agreed to watch the kids." Her tone shifted instantly, panic wrapped in anger. "Lauren, don't do this right now. Everyone is already here. Brooke and Ethan are unloading the car. The kids are asking where you are. You can't just back out at the last minute." I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't back out. I never agreed. She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "This is not the time for semantics. We planned this around you." "That's the problem," I said quietly. "You planned it around me without asking." In the background, a child started crying loudly. Someone else shouted about juice spilling. My mother's breath came fast and shallow. "You are being incredibly selfish," she snapped. Do you have any idea what kind of position you're putting me in? I opened my eyes and stared at the wall across from me. Yes, I do. It's the same position you've been putting me in for years. She went silent for half a second, then exploded. This is Christmas. This is family. You don't just abandon people when they need you. I felt the old guilt try to claw its way back in sharp and familiar. But something held firm this time. I'm not abandoning anyone, I said. I'm choosing not to be used as the solution for a problem I didn't create. Her voice dropped dangerous and low. I told everyone you promised. I swallowed. I know you did. That admission seemed to knock the wind out of her. You're embarrassing me, she whispered. Do you realize how this looks? There it was. Not concern for me, not concern for the kids. Concern for how it looked. I straightened my shoulders. I'm not responsible for how it looks when you make promises on my behalf. She started crying, then real tears this time, or at least real enough to sound convincing. I can't do this alone, Lauren. I'm not young anymore. This is too much. The sound of her distress tugged at me hard. For a moment, I imagined myself driving over, stepping into the chaos, taking over like I always had. I imagined the relief in her voice, the way everything would settle back into place. And then I imagined next year. And the year after that. And the rest of my life. I'm sorry you're overwhelmed, I said, and I meant it. But this is not my responsibility. She sobbed harder. Your brother and sister are furious. They booked everything because of you. Because of what you told them? I corrected gently. Her crying stopped abruptly. She inhaled sharply like someone pulling themselves together. So that's it, she said coldly. You're just going to let us drown. I paused. No. I'm letting you figure it out. She hung up on me. The silence afterward felt deafening. My hands were shaking, adrenaline coursing through me, but beneath it was a strange sense of release. The truth was out now. There was no pulling it back. Almost immediately, my phone lit up again. Ethan this time. What the hell is going on? He demanded as soon as I answered. Mom says you're not coming. Tell me this is a misunderstanding. It's not, I said. I never agreed to this. You can't do this, Lauren, he snapped. We already dropped the kids off. Brooke and I have plans. I closed my eyes briefly. You dropped the kids off without confirming with me. Don't play dumb, he said. Mom told us you were handling it. Then you should talk to Mom about why she told you that, I replied. His voice rose. This isn't about Mom. This is about you leaving us hanging. I felt something harden in my chest. I have spent years catching everyone when they fall, Ethan. I'm not doing it this time. He scoffed. So what, you're teaching us a lesson? No, I said. I'm protecting myself. He started to argue, words tumbling over each other, frustration bleeding through every sentence. I listened until there was a pause. You never even asked me, I said into the silence. Not once. You just assumed. There was a long moment where he didn't respond. When he finally did, his voice was tight. Mom said you always complain, but you always show up. I almost laughed. That's because I was taught that complaining was allowed as long as it didn't change anything. He didn't have a comeback for that. We ended the call without resolution, his anger unresolved, my boundary intact. The group chat was pure chaos now. Brooke accusing Mom of lying. Mom insisting she didn't lie, that I had implied I would help. Accusations flying back and forth, none of them aimed at me for once. I read through it slowly, my heart pounding, a strange sense of distance growing with every message. This was what it looked like when I wasn't there to absorb the impact. The cracks I had been filling for years were finally visible. A message from my aunt popped up, private this time. Is it true you're not there? I typed back honestly. Yes. A pause. Then another message. Good for you. I stared at those 3 words longer than I expected. I checked the time. If I was going to go, I needed to leave. I picked up my bag and stepped out the door, locking it behind me with deliberate care. The hallway smelled like pine cleaner and someone else's holiday cooking. Life going on. As I drove, my phone kept buzzing in the passenger seat. I didn't answer it again. Not because I didn't care, but because nothing I said now would make this easier without undoing everything. At the airport, the chaos was different. Loud, but impersonal. People rushing announcements, echoing suitcases rolling across tile floors. I checked in, went through security, and found my gate. Each step felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body. Half an hour before boarding, I finally looked at my phone again. A video call request from my mother. I hesitated, then answered. Her face filled the screen, flushed and frantic. Behind her, the living room looked like a war zone. Toys everywhere. Wrapping paper torn apart. Kids crying, arguing, climbing on furniture. My brother pacing. My sister yelling from another room. "You did this?" My mother said, her voice shaking. "This cannot be happening." I angled the camera slightly so she could see where I was. The gate sign behind me, my bag at my feet. The quiet order of the airport. "I told you I had plans," I said softly. She stared at the screen, disbelief etched into her face. "You're really leaving?" "Yes," I said. "I really am." Her mouth opened, then closed again. The realization seemed to hit her all at once. Not just that I wasn't coming, but that I wasn't rushing in to fix it. That I had chosen myself. She covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide. "What am I supposed to do now?" I didn't answer right away. The truth was, she would figure it out. Just like she always had, just without me cushioning the fall. "I hope you find a way through today," I said. "But I'm not responsible for this." She shook her head slowly, stunned. "I can't believe you would do this to me." I met her gaze through the screen. "I can't believe you thought I wouldn't." The call ended shortly after her, still staring, still gasping, still trying to process a reality that no longer bent to her expectations. When my boarding group was called, I stood, lifted my bag, and walked toward the gate. Behind me, my phone buzzed one last time, then went quiet. Ahead of me was the unknown, not perfect, not painless, but finally my own. The plane lifted off smoothly, the city shrinking beneath the clouds, and for the first time in days, my phone went silent. Not because no one was calling, but because I had put it face down and left it that way. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes, my heart still racing, my hands buzzing with leftover adrenaline. I had expected relief to come all at once. Instead, what I felt first was grief. Not the dramatic kind. The quiet kind that settles in when you realize something fundamental has changed and will never go back to what it was. I wasn't grieving the chaos I had just walked away from. I was grieving the version of my family I had hoped for, the one where love didn't come with conditions and help wasn't mistaken for obligation. As the seatbelt sign turned off, a flight attendant smiled and asked if I wanted water. I nodded, my throat tight, surprised by how simple kindness felt when it wasn't tangled up with expectations. Somewhere over the clouds, my phone vibrated against my thigh. I ignored it. Then it vibrated again, and again. I took a slow breath and reminded myself that nothing I said now would fix what had already happened. The damage had been done long before today. All I had done was stop covering it up. When the plane landed, the air felt warmer, softer, like I had stepped into a different rhythm entirely. I moved through the airport on autopilot, collecting my bag, following signs, letting my body carry me forward, while my mind lagged behind. Outside, the light was golden, the kind that makes everything look gentler than it really is. I stood there for a moment, just breathing, listening to unfamiliar sounds, the hum of traffic, distant laughter, a breeze moving through palm trees. No one here knew my role. No one expected anything from me. The drive to where I was staying felt surreal. Every mile put more distance between me and the house filled with noise and accusations. And yet the guilt tried to follow me, whispering that I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That night, I finally checked my phone. It was worse than I expected, and somehow also exactly what I had predicted. Dozens of messages, missed calls, voicemails. The family group chat looked like a battlefield. Brooke furious, Ethan defensive. My mother oscillating between panic and outrage, trying to steer the narrative, trying to make it sound like I had vanished without warning. She changed her mind at the last minute. I don't know what got into her. We were counting on her. Reading it made my jaw tighten. I hadn't changed my mind. I had finally acted on it. A private message from Brooke sat at the top of my screen. You completely blindsided us. Do you have any idea how selfish this was? I stared at the words for a long time before responding. I typed deleted typed again. Every version sounded defensive or apologetic, or like an invitation to argue. I didn't want to explain myself anymore. I didn't want to negotiate my worth. So I wrote the truth plain and simple. I told Mom weeks ago I had other plans. I never agreed to watch the kids. I'm sorry you're stressed, but this wasn't my decision to undo. I hit send and set the phone down again. The next few days passed in a strange duality. During the day, I did things I hadn't allowed myself to enjoy in years. Long walks, quiet mornings, sitting by the water with nothing but my thoughts. I ate when I was hungry, rested when I was tired, let time stretch without filling every moment with responsibility. At night, the fallout caught up to me. Messages trickled in, some angry, some accusatory, some quiet and confused. A few from extended family asking what had happened. One from my aunt telling me she was proud of me for finally standing up for myself. That one made me cry. The most difficult messages were from my mother. At first, they were frantic. How could you do this to me? I can't believe you embarrassed me like that. Everyone is talking about what you did. Then gradually the tone shifted. This has been the hardest Christmas of my life. Your brother and sister fought the entire time. I didn't realize how much I relied on you. That last one stopped me cold. I read it over and over, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was there. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. On the third night, my mother called. I almost didn't answer. I stood on the balcony, the night air warm against my skin, my phone buzzing in my hand. A part of me wanted to protect the peace I had found here, to let the call go to voicemail and deal with it later. Another part knew this conversation was coming whether I delayed it or not. I answered. Her voice was quieter than I expected. No yelling, no accusations, just tired. Hi, she said. Hi. There was a pause long enough that I could hear her breathing. Christmas was a mess, she said finally. I didn't respond. I let her talk. Your father tried to help, but the kids were everywhere. Brooke and Ethan blamed each other. At one point, I just sat down and cried in the kitchen. I kept thinking this isn't how it's supposed to be. I closed my eyes. It's not, I said softly. She sighed. I didn't realize how much I'd built everything around you being there. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, but this time it wasn't just pain. It was validation. You never asked, I said. You just assumed. I know, she said. And then, after another pause, I shouldn't have done that. The words were small, not dramatic, but they landed heavier than any apology I had imagined. I wanted to rush in and soften it, to reassure her that everything would be okay, that I wasn't angry, that we could just move past it. The old reflex flared up instinctively. I didn't follow it. You hurt me, Mom, I said. Not just this year. For a long time. I know, she whispered. We talked for a while after that. Not a neat conversation, not a healing montage, just two people sitting with the consequences of years of unspoken expectations. She admitted she had used me as her safety net. I admitted I had let her. That didn't make it okay. but it made it honest. When we hung up, I felt drained but lighter, like I had finally put something down I'd been carrying too long. The rest of my trip passed quietly. I didn't avoid my family entirely, but I didn't rush to respond to every message either. I let space exist. I let myself enjoy the present without constantly managing the future. When I flew home, the airport felt different than it had on the way out. Not charged with escape, but steady. I wasn't running from something anymore. I was returning with boundaries intact. At home, the apartment greeted me with the same quiet it always had. But this time, it didn't feel empty. It felt peaceful. The group chat had gone quiet by then. Not resolved. Just paused. I knew there were conversations still to come. Hurt feelings. Adjustments. Maybe even resentment that would take time to fade. But I also knew something else. They had felt the weight of what I carried. For one chaotic holiday, the system had collapsed without me propping it up. The perfect image had cracked. The assumptions had been exposed. And no matter how uncomfortable it was for them, that truth couldn't be unlearned. As I unpacked my bag and set it back in the closet, I understood that this wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a different one. One where I wasn't the invisible fix. One where my time wasn't automatically owed. One where love didn't require me to disappear. And for the first time, I was willing to let things remain unresolved long enough for real change to take root. The week after I got back, the quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watchful, like the air itself was waiting to see what I would do next. My apartment was the same as I'd left it, the same mugs in the cabinet, the same stack of mail on the counter, but I moved through it differently. I didn't rush. I didn't check my phone every 5 minutes. I didn't brace myself for the next crisis. That was new. And because it was new, it was uncomfortable. The family group chat stayed mostly silent, the way a room goes quiet after someone slams a door. A few stray messages appeared from distant relatives, polite and careful, like they didn't know which side they were supposed to be on. My mother didn't post at all. Neither did Brooke or Ethan. The absence of their noise should have felt like relief, but at first it felt like punishment, like being iced out. Like the familiar warning I had grown up with, the one that said, "If you don't fall in line, you will be left behind." I caught myself thinking about it in the middle of ordinary moments, while I folded laundry, while I waited at a red light, while I stood in line at the pharmacy. It was a low-grade anxiety that followed me, not sharp enough to stop me from functioning, but persistent enough to keep tapping at the edges of my thoughts. "This is what happens when you disappoint them," the old voice whispered. Then another voice, steadier, answered back. "This is what happens when you stop being useful." That second thought was harder to swallow because it was too close to the truth. 2 days after New Year's, I finally opened the group chat and scrolled. Not because anyone had asked me to, but because I needed to see what had happened when I wasn't there to smooth it all over. The first messages were still furious, written in the raw heat of the moment. Brooke accusing, Ethan demanding, my mother trying to sound authoritative and wounded at the same time. But then a shift. Brooke had written something late Christmas night after hours of chaos, and the tone was different. Not aimed at me, aimed at Mom. "Why did you tell us she agreed when she didn't? You do this all the time." Then Ethan, blunt and tired. "Mom, you said it was handled. We booked everything because of what you told us." And my mother clinging to her story. She didn't say no. She knew what we needed. She chose to ruin it anyway. Reading that made my jaw tighten, but I kept going. I needed to see it all, even the parts that hurt. Brooke replied. "Stop. She told you she had plans. You just ignored it because you expected her to cave." That sentence hit me harder than any accusation, not because it was cruel, but because it was true, and because it had come from Brooke. My sister, the one who had always benefited the most from my compliance, was finally saying it out loud. A few messages later, Ethan added something I never thought I would see from him. I didn't even think to ask her directly. I just assumed Mom had it worked out. That's on me too. I sat on my couch staring at those words, the room suddenly too quiet. A part of me wanted to screenshot them, save them proof that I wasn't crazy, that I hadn't imagined the pattern. Another part of me felt sad, because it shouldn't have taken a ruined Christmas for them to notice. It shouldn't have taken me leaving for the truth to surface. That night, my phone buzzed with a private message from Brooke. It took me a full minute to open it. Her text was short. "Are you home?" I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. For years, those words would have been followed by a request, a demand, a problem I was expected to solve. Even now, my body braced like it was about to be hit. I typed back, "Yes." She didn't respond immediately. When she did, the words were slower, careful. "Can we talk?" I almost said no, not out of spite, but out of exhaustion. The idea of stepping back into that emotional tornado made my chest tighten. But I also knew that if things were going to change, some conversations had to happen. I wrote, "Okay." She called a few minutes later. Her voice sounded different. Still tense but not sharp. More tired than angry. "Hey," she said. "Hey." There was an awkward pause, like we were both feeling the distance and not sure how to cross it. "I don't even know where to start," she admitted. "Start with what you actually want to say," I replied, keeping my voice calm. She exhaled. "I was furious, Lauren. Like really furious. I thought you just ditched us and I was holding two kids while trying to fix my hair. And Mom was melting down and Ethan was yelling and it was just insane." I let her speak. I didn't interrupt. I didn't apologize. Not because I wasn't sorry they were stressed, but because apologizing had always been my way of absorbing responsibility that wasn't mine. Then Brooke's voice softened almost reluctantly. But after that night, I couldn't stop thinking about something, about how normal it felt to just assign you. Like it didn't even cross my mind that you had a choice. My throat tightened. "That's what I've been trying to say." "I know," she said quickly. "I know. And I hate that I didn't see it. I hate that I was part of it. Mom always framed it like you were fine with it, like you didn't mind because you don't have kids. And I believed it because it was easier. Easier. There was honesty in that word. Brooke, I said, I love the kids. I love you. But I'm not going to keep paying for everyone else's comfort with my own life." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, smaller now, "I didn't realize how much you were doing until you weren't there." The sentence landed deep, not triumphant, just heavy. We talked a little longer, not about the fight itself, but about the pattern, about how Mom had always volunteered me, about how Brooke had accepted it without questioning because she was overwhelmed and grateful, and it felt normal. When we hung up, I didn't feel fully healed. I felt wrung out. But I also felt something else. The beginnings of a shift. Not a miracle, but a crack in the old system. The next day, Ethan texted. His message was clumsy, like someone who wasn't used to owning their mistakes. "I should have asked you directly." "I didn't. That wasn't fair." I stared at it, the words blurring slightly. Not because it was perfect, but because it was rare. Ethan wasn't the type to admit fault easily. I wrote back, "Thank you. I'm not trying to punish anyone. I'm trying to stop being taken for granted." He replied almost immediately, "I get it. I didn't before, but I get it now." I set the phone down and let that settle. For the first time, the blame wasn't landing entirely on me. The family was turning inward, examining the real source of the collapse. My mother, however, stayed silent. Days passed. Then another week. No calls, no messages. Just quiet. And I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt. I kept remembering little moments from childhood, the way she used to braid my hair before school, the way she clapped the loudest at my graduation. I loved her. That was the problem. Loving her made the boundary feel like betrayal, even when I knew it wasn't. On a random Tuesday evening while I was sorting a basket of clean towels, my phone buzzed. Mom. I froze, towel in hand, heart thudding. I almost let it go to voicemail. The old part of me wanted to hide to avoid the confrontation, to keep the peace by staying silent. But another part of me, the part that had finally stepped onto that plane, knew that avoiding her would just keep the pattern alive in a new form. So I answered. Hello? Her voice sounded older than it had a month ago. Not weak, just worn. Like someone who had spent weeks replaying a scene and not liking what she saw. Hi, she said. Hi. A pause. I want to talk, she said quietly. Not fight. Talk. I sat down at my table, the towel forgotten. Okay, I said. I'm listening. She inhaled slow and shaky. Christmas was a disaster, she admitted. I didn't respond. I let her continue. Your father ended up ordering pizza. The twins dumped juice on the rug. Brooke and Ethan were snapping at each other all night. At one point, I looked around and realized I had been trying to control everything, and I couldn't. Her voice wavered slightly, then steadied. And then, my sister called me. Your Aunt Denise. I blinked. Aunt Denise rarely got involved. She asked me why I thought it was your job to fix everything. My mother continued. She said, why do you keep putting Lauren in that position? My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. What did you tell her? I asked. My mother hesitated. I told her you're reliable, that you don't have as much going on, that you can handle it. The honesty stung, even though I'd heard those same sentiments in different words my whole life. Then she said, and Denise told me, maybe you just assumed she doesn't matter as much because she doesn't complain. The air in my apartment felt still. My mother's voice dropped. I didn't like hearing it said that way. I didn't like how it sounded. I swallowed hard. That's how it feels, I said quietly. I know, she whispered. And then softer still, I'm sorry. The words were simple, unpolished. No grand speech, no defense, no but. It didn't erase years of pain, but it cracked something open. I'm sorry I told everyone you promised, she continued. I'm sorry I used you as a guarantee. I wanted Christmas to look perfect, and I leaned on you because it was easy. Easy. That word again. Everyone's comfort had been easy because I had carried the weight. I closed my eyes. Mom, I said you didn't just do that this year. I know, she answered, and the way she said it sounded like she finally understood the scope. We sat in that truth for a moment, the silence thick but not hostile. Then I said slowly, here's what happens now. If you want my help, you ask. You don't tell. You don't assume. And if I say no, you accept it. No guilt trips. No real responsibility speeches. No making me the villain. Her breath hitched. That's fair, she said. And if you ever tell someone I promised something I didn't, I added, we're done. I mean it. I won't clean up that lie again. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very small, I don't want to be that person anymore. I didn't answer right away, not because I didn't believe her, but because belief wasn't enough. Change had to show up in actions. When we ended the call, it wasn't with everything wrapped up neatly. It was with a fragile truce, a new set of lines drawn in the sand. I sat at my table afterwards, staring at the dark screen of my phone. The fallout wasn't over. Not completely. But for the first time, it felt like the truth was finally on the table, and no one could shove it back under my silence. The weeks that followed felt quieter but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm when the air is still charged, and you know things have shifted even if the landscape looks the same. I moved through my days with a new awareness, noticing how often I reached for my phone out of habit, expecting a crisis that never came. The family didn't fall apart without me. That was the first truth I had to accept. They struggled, yes. They argued more. Plans took longer. Things didn't run as smoothly, but no one died. The kids were fine. The house survived. Christmas passed messy and imperfect, but it passed. And that reality did something no argument ever could. It proved that my constant sacrifice had been optional. In early spring, my sister texted me again. The message was different this time, tentative in a way I'd never seen from her before. "We're thinking about doing a small barbecue next month. Just family. No babysitting expectations. You in if you want." I stared at the screen for a long moment, letting myself feel the difference. She wasn't asking what I could do for her. She was asking if I wanted to be there. I replied, "Maybe. Let me check my schedule." And I meant it. When the day came, I showed up late on purpose. Not to make a point, but to see what would happen if I didn't arrive early to set everything up. The grill was already going. The kids were running around the yard. My brother was flipping burgers badly. My mother was hovering, trying not to micromanage. No one handed me a child. No one asked me to take over. My mom caught my eye from across the yard. There was a flicker of something there. Old instinct, maybe the reflex to direct me toward the nearest problem. Then she stopped herself. She smiled instead and handed me a drink. I took it without comment. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, long pauses in conversation. A few times I felt the familiar pull to jump in and fix something, but I stayed where I was. I laughed when something was funny. I stepped back when it wasn't my responsibility. When I left that afternoon, my sister hugged me and said thanks for coming, not thanks for helping. That distinction mattered more than I expected. My relationship with my mother didn't transform overnight. We were careful with each other at first, like people learning to walk on new ground. She caught herself mid-sentence more than once. Old habits don't disappear quietly. But she asked now. She waited for answers. And when I said no, the world didn't end. One afternoon she called me just to talk. No request attached. We spoke about ordinary things, the weather, a neighbor's dog, a show she'd been watching. Halfway through the conversation, she stopped and laughed softly. "I almost asked you to help with something," she admitted. Then I remembered I didn't need to. I smiled to myself. Progress doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it whispers. There were still moments of guilt. Boundaries don't erase decades of conditioning overnight. Sometimes I lay in bed replaying old scenes, wondering if I'd been too harsh, too abrupt, too final. But then I remembered how it felt to be invisible, how my life had been treated like spare change, something easy to spend. And I reminded myself that protecting my time wasn't cruelty. It was honesty. The kids adjusted too. They stopped looking for me as the automatic solution. They learned to ask their parents. They learned that adults take turns, that no one person is responsible for everyone else's comfort. I didn't become distant from my family. I became clearer. That was the real shift. Not revenge, not punishment, just clarity. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see then. My mother's gasp, that moment of disbelief when she realized I wasn't coming, wasn't just about Christmas falling apart. It was about control slipping through her fingers. It was about the illusion cracking. The illusion that love meant access, that family meant entitlement. When that illusion broke, it forced all of us to rebuild on something more honest. I didn't win by leaving. I won by returning differently. If you've ever been the one everyone relies on without asking, the one whose plans are always flexible, whose time is treated like a resource instead of a life, I want you to hear this. You are not required to burn yourself to keep others warm. Sometimes the only way people learn your value is by feeling your absence. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for them is to step back and let the truth surface. I don't know what next Christmas will look like. Maybe I'll be there laughing, sharing stories, watching the kids from a distance while someone else takes a turn. Maybe I'll be somewhere else entirely, choosing quiet again. What I do know is this. My life no longer exists on standby. If this story felt familiar to you, if you've lived some version of it in your own family, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Would you have done the same? Would you have gone further? Or are you still standing where I used to stand, wondering if it's too late to choose yourself? If this resonated, take a moment to share it, leave a comment, or stay with the channel for more stories like this. You're not alone, and sometimes hearing one story is enough to give you permission to start rewriting your own.